collaboration with the Religious Studies program's Retzel Family Lecture. Together, we are pleased to welcome Brendan Jamal Thornton, who will present Mapping the Spiritual Baptist Universe, Black Atlantic Cosmography and the Spatial Dimensions of Religious Imagination in Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Bianette Castellanos, and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. For those of you who are joining us online, I'm a brown-skinned woman with dark hair wearing glasses with black frames. IAS Thursdays is a regular event series that brings a wide range of ideas, conversations, and viewpoints to the heart of the University of Minnesota, and it is designed for scholars from all walks of life. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the ancestral and contemporary lands of Dakota people. Since land acknowledgements are just a beginning for respectfully recognizing Dakota people's history on this land and their sovereignty, the IAS is actively revising our statement to concretely outline our commitments to working with tribal nations to affirm their tribal sovereignty, reckon with their painful past, and counter historical and contemporary injustices. The IAS is also committed to denouncing state-sponsored violence and racism. We also stand in solidarity with the families and loved ones of Dante Wright, George Floyd, Jamar Clark, and Philando Castile, who were all killed by police violence in Minnesota. And there's many more that we are unable to name today. We are committed to working alongside our relatives to dismantle the systems that seek to do harm, to sharing power, and to building a just university together. We also have a number of exciting opportunities available that I'd like to share with you today. For those of you who are graduate students, you have until November 1 to apply for the Humanities Without Walls National Predoctoral Career Diversity Summer Workshop, which will be held here at the University of Minnesota in this coming summer, 2023. Oh, sorry, the deadline is the 7th, November 7th. And also, on the same date, we have the deadline for the Residential Faculty Summer Fellowship Program on November 7th. And for more information on these applications, you can look at the Opportunities page of the IAS website. We also hope that you will join us for our next event on Thursday, November 10th, back here at the Best Buy Theater and also online. The Spotlight Series presents Public Monuments and the Human Landscape, and our panelists will discuss the Monument Lab's National Monument Audit and our substantial but incomplete collection of murals and monuments. And for those of you interested in receiving information about our upcoming events, funding and program offerings, you can also sign up for our newsletter by visiting our website or checking the chat for the link to sign up. Finally, before we begin go further into our program, I just want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members. All IAS Thursdays, including this one, include cart captioning. We recommend that online attendees view captions by clicking the stream text link shared via the chat. We will also be using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A, though those of you here in the audience today can also ask questions. If you raise your hand, we will bring a microphone to you. For those of you willing and able to use Slido, please use your smartphone and either scan the QR code displayed on the screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code IAS Thursday. Questions do have a 160-character limit. You can submit your questions anonymously or add your name. And please know that in order for us to respond to as many questions as possible, we may occasionally combine related questions. And now it is my pleasure to pass the microphone to Jeannie Kildee, Director of the Religious Studies Program, our partner for today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianette. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So glad to see so many of you here and several of my students, so well done. It's my pleasure to welcome you then to the 2022 Retzel Family Lecture, the 9th in a series of nearly annual lectures in religious studies that we launched in 2011 and that have been made possible by the generous support of Calvin and Caroline Retzel. And I'm pleased to say Calvin is here in the audience with us today. This endowment makes it possible for our interdepartmental religious studies program to welcome to our campus, to engage with and learn from top-notch scholars from around the country. Over the years, this lectureship has featured historians of several religions, and we have an alumnus of a speaker here with Jim Stewart as a historian of religion, well, we won't go into that. A biblical studies scholar, specialists in religion and the environment, specialists in religion and the law, and today we welcome an anthropologist focusing on African diasporic religious practices. We are very grateful to the Retzel family, Calvin, Professor Emeritus, and the former Sundet Chair in New Testament and Christian Studies here at the university, who has been instrumental in establishing not only this lectureship, but the Interdepartmental Religious Studies program itself. And we're grateful to everyone else who has supported this lectureship over the years. I want to thank Bionette as well, Susanna Smith, Abby Travis, and all the IAS staff for partnering with us again this year in what is now a really well-established tradition. I also want to thank the other co-sponsoring units in the College of Liberal Arts, including the African and African American Studies Department, the Center for Pre-Modern Studies, and the History Department. And lastly, after the lecture and after the Q&A today, please join us for some light refreshments in the gallery, which I think is on this level as you go out. Let me turn then to our speaker for today. Dr. Brendan Jamal Thornton is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, San Diego. For those of you unfamiliar with the interdisciplinary field of religious studies, the combination of religion and anthropology may raise curiosity. But insiders know well that anthropology is one of the taproots of the study of religion in the Western Academy. The discipline of anthropology brought to the table not only some of the very first studies of human religious behavior and activity through observational fieldwork, but also a century of critical attention to methods used in the study of religions and religious people, and to the underlying theories that shape our ideas of what this thing called religion is, what boundaries do we place around it, what assumptions do we bring to it, and what consequences ensue. It is research with roots in anthropological methods of ethnography that have spurred some of the most exciting developments in the study of religion, at least in my mind. And that's interested in lived religions, how people actually live out their religious practices. And this in turn has directly increased scholarly attention into the spaces and geographies created for religious activities and or in which religious activities occur. Professor Thornton weaves together these threads: ethnographic fieldwork, methods, interest in lived religions and religious spaces, with his central subject area, diasporic African communities and their religious activities. His recent publications demonstrate this woven aspect. In 2016, his book, Negotiating Respect, Pentecostalism, Masculinity, and the Politics of Spiritual Authority in the Dominican Republic, appeared from the University of Florida Press. Last year in 2021, he published an article in the very prestigious Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the article entitled Refiguring Christianity and Black Atlantic Religion, Representation, Essentialism, and Christian Variation in the Southern Caribbean. And his similarly titled forthcoming book from Duke University Press will be Rethinking Christianity and Black Atlantic Religion, Identity, Cosmology, and Christian Variation in the Southern Caribbean. This ethnographic work locates Professor Thornton as one of the leading scholars in a very exciting upswelling of innovative research on African diasporic religion in the Caribbean region. But the theoretical and methodological thread remains important in his work as well, demonstrated most recently in his article, Fieldwork, Time, Fidelity, and Ethnographic Method in Religious Studies, which appeared this year in a special issue of the open access journal Fieldwork in Religion, a special issue that he co-edited, focused on critical terms in the ethnography of religion. We are again reminded of the important contribution of critical theoretical and methodological inquiry of the field of anthropology that the field of anthropology has contributed to religious studies. Dr. Thornton's list of articles and publications goes on, publications in many scholarly journals, the Latin American Research Review, Anthropological Quarterly, Religion, and others. He's also contributed chapters to many collections, and in fact, his work came to my attention as I was seeking authors for the Oxford Handbook of Religious Space, to which he ultimately contributed a chapter on the very subject he will be telling us about today. So please welcome me join me in welcoming Dr. Brendan Jamal Thornton, who takes for his title today, Mapping the Spiritual Baptist Universe, Black Atlantic Cosmography, and the Spatial Dimensions of Religious Imagination in Trinidad and Tobago. Brendan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. That was probably the nicest introduction I've ever received. I'll try not to disappoint after such a warm introduction. I think I can skip some of the first part of this, though, because everybody's been thanked. But you haven't been thanked yet, and I just wanted to thank you also for your warm invitation. Thanks again, obviously, to the Institute for Advanced Study for inviting me as well and making this possible. The Retzel Family Lecture as well for making my visit possible. My talk today, as Jeannie kind of gestured toward, draws on comprehensive ethnographic research that I've been conducting on spiritual Baptist Christianity in Trinidad and Tobago since 2017. But I want to make it clear before I get started that these thoughts on this topic, my thoughts on this topic, are kind of still being developed. And they do represent a part of this larger book project that Jeannie mentioned as well. I have a bunch of images that I'm going to share throughout the talk. So I'm going to go over a few minutes further than maybe I would love to, but I hope it's going to be, I promise you it's going to be worth it. You just got to bear with me until the end. So much of the folks that I work with in Trinidad, these spiritual Baptists, so much of their culture is visual, so I had to include images here. I want to start with a couple quotes that I think get at the core of my talk today. I'll quote these two individuals once or twice more this afternoon. They've become dear friends of mine over the past 6 years and have been pivotal to what I've been able to accomplish since first starting this project. If I have anything of interest to say today on this topic, it truly is because it's thanks to their openness and generosity and friendship, so big thanks to them as well. I include these for their framing, but the words that they're using are intentional. Bishop Andre says, there are a lot of heights and a lot of depths in this spiritual Baptist thing, if one really wants to dig deep down inside of it. The other, Apostle Michael says, we fully believe that the spiritual world controls the carnal world. There's a spiritual and physical world. One is laid on top of the other. Everything that is spiritual can be manifested physically. I assume, folks, this is probably the first time you've even heard about this group. You know? So I'm gonna start kind of by telling you a little bit about them. Spiritual Baptist Christianity is an autochthonous Afro-Caribbean religious tradition in Trinidad and Tobago in its diaspora. And it can be characterized by its unique articulation of fundamentalist, charismatic, and other Christianities, combining Anglican, Baptist, and Pentecostal conventions with assorted elements from African-derived, Hindu, Masonic, New Age, occult, and Western esoteric traditions. Born of the region's colonial and post-colonial multicultural history and renewed through continual inspiration from religious sources, domestic and foreign, Spiritual Baptist Christianity is a distinctive Creole complex whose adherents distinguish themselves as both steadfast Christian traditionalists and cosmopolitan doyens of the spirit. That is, holistic spiritual masons who transcend conventional religious boundaries by incorporating diverse cosmologies and embracing metaphysical unity. In practice, spiritual Baptists are effectively pluralists. Regardless of their Christian investments, members might at any time rely on religious concepts, philosophies, or worship methods that have been borrowed from sources as distinct as Ifa, a belief system originating in West Africa, to Kabbalah, which in Trinidad refers to a creolized form of occult spiritism. Baptist fluidity in this regard is facilitated by a common belief that a single spiritual reality common to all allies diverse religious traditions locally and around the world. Different religions, from this perspective, are viewed merely as different approaches or pathways to the same divine reality, alternative ways of worshiping the same God. With no official canon to adhere to, theological variation across Baptist churches is the norm rather than the exception, with several competing while several competing orthodoxies exist, from more or less plural and incorporative to deliberately anti-syncretic, no authoritative orthodoxy reigns supreme. Despite this variation, however, the Baptist community in Trinidad and Tobago maintains a strong collective identity united by a core set of shared ritual practices and commonly held beliefs. Notable among these are the customary rites of baptism and mourning, essential to the faith's distinctiveness, as well as a remarkably eclectic cosmology distinguished by a novel cosmopolitan spiritual geography. Notwithstanding their obvious deviation from mainstream Christianities, spiritual Baptists view themselves as Christian originalists and enthusiastically declare the inerrancy of the Bible and the absolute authority of the Word. This strict adherence to Scripture and firm commitment to traditional theological tenets gives spiritual Baptists a fundamentalist cast, described by native Baptist scholar Hazel Ann Gibbs de Peza as, quote, Christianity with an accent. These indigenous Christians committed to observing the, quote, ancient ways see as their primary mission, according to the Reverend Patricia Stevens, quote, calling sinners to repentance and to baptism by the Holy Spirit in living, running water. Many features of spiritual Baptist belief and practice set it apart from the crowd, perhaps none more so than this blending of conservative Christianity and flexible pluralism. The combination of fundamentalism and eclecticism, traditionalism, and heterodoxy is what makes the spiritual Baptist faith an instructive exemplar of Afro-Creole religiosity and a prime site for exploring the fluid possibilities of Christian identity in the African diaspora and beyond. My talk today considers cosmography as a way to untangle the creolized architecture of the spiritual Baptist faith and to render in greater detail the relationship between theology, cosmology, and ritual space as figured by the faithful. Doing so brings to light a productive but underexplored area of critical inquiry into Afro-Caribbean and Black Atlantic religions. Drawing on my research, particularly with leaders in the spiritual Baptist faith, I'm going to diagram and analyze the sacred geography of spirit, analyzing the Baptist mystical universe, an attempt to unpack the spatial metaphors informing ritual logic in the church. By examining spatial dynamics underlying Baptist epistemologies, I hope to illustrate the novel representational practices central to meaning-making in the church and make sense of the conjunctive properties of fundamentalism and eclecticism that categorize the faith. What is the spiritual universe imagined to be like? What are its qualities, its dimensions, its limits? And what is its relationship to the physical material world? For Baptists, these questions are not trivialities. In fact, they form the basis of their everyday pursuit of spiritual knowledge and constitute the driving force behind many of the rites they perform. The spiritual world, understood to be a distinct part, understood to be a distinct place apart from, but very much proximate to and entangled with the material world, is a concrete reality for spiritual Baptists, one made all the more tangible through the everyday witnessing of its mysteries. It is believed to be a real location, however enigmatic, accessible to the true believer, conceived as a place of profound mysteries with geographic and demographic features that mirror the physical material world. Spiritual Baptists do not merely talk about the spiritual world, they travel to it. They walk, swim, and climb through it. They report on its features. They take note of its laws, detail its idiosyncrasies. They chart its limits. They measure its depths, and they document its inhabitants. They work cooperatively to learn about it. They map it in order to verify it through rituals like mourning that help to substantiate their methodical investigations of it. Baptists strive for deeper knowledge of the spiritual world around them to help develop insights that will guide them along their spiritual journey. The goal, ultimately, is to cultivate spiritual selves superior enough to rise above the carnal preoccupations that are said to burden humanity and keep it in suffering. In order to fully flesh out the spiritual Baptist cosmology and unpack the ideas and practices that sustain it, it's necessary to explore the spatial concepts churchgoers use to articulate this knowable but not always visible universe. For Baptists, the church itself, along with the rituals performed to consecrate and protect it, carry complex cosmographic significance. Even their most important rites and ceremonies invoke a sacred geography that carries with it complex cosmological ideas, albeit veiled by their multifaceted symbolic elaboration. The diagram here is a cosmogram that I composed in consultation with several Baptist advisors. It depicts a religio-spatial conceptual scheme featuring signs of locality and identity that index Trinidad and Tobago's principal demographic divisions and encodes them as essential spiritual values oriented around a Christian authority. These values, what I'm calling 4 ethno-national modalities of spirit that believers refer to as spiritual schools or nations, namely Africa, India, China, and Assyria, they also say Syria, they comprise the basic subdivisions of the spiritual Baptist universe and constitute the primary framework within which believers identify and interpret mystical experiences. This usually implicit schematic formulation guides the faithful in configuring ritual spaces, classifying supernatural phenomena, and naming the spiritual identities they assume along their quest for salvation. Also referred to as, quote, spiritual centers of the universe, or, quote, 4 separate ideas of godliness, each designating alternative sides or paths, they say, in the spirit. These so-called nations make up the spiritual geography of the non-physical world, which initiates traverse on the mourning ground, visit in trance-like states during worship, and sometimes navigate in dreams or visions. As a symbolic representation of the spiritual universe, the cosmogram I've rendered here summarizes key concepts, identities, and interrelationships germane to the unique stylings of the faith. As a conceptual map, the cosmogram conveys a geographic identity and spatial order to the immaterial world, while affirming the basic principles of association and classification that govern ritual conduct. At its core, spiritual Baptist cosmography synthesizes the faith's eclectic spiritual imaginary by squaring, both literally and figuratively, its heterogeneous components with an unambiguously Christocentric worldview. The colors have relevance as well, that I probably won't talk about, but if you want to talk about it afterward, I'll come back to it. The spiritual Baptist, the Baptist spiritual realm is primarily visualized as a square or a rectangle, oriented by the 4 cardinal directions and divided into 4 what they call corners, referred to as spiritual schools or nations. That's the Africa, India, China, or Assyria. With few exceptions, all Baptist churches, permanent or transient ritual spaces, including tent services, Thanksgiving tables, baptismal beaches, and mourning rooms, are arranged to reflect this basic conceptual ideal. The 4 outermost corners of the church are numbered 1 through 4 and associated with the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, Raphael, Otherwise, the corners may be dedicated to the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And John, I should say. Aisles leading from the main entrance to the altar. So if you can imagine, this is a church. This is usually the entrance. The altar is situated above here. The E for east is being covered there. And these are usually side doors to the church. I'll show you some pictures here in a moment. But aisles leading from the main entrance to the altar and from the side doors of the church to the other create what is understood to be a Christian cross, right? Dividing the nave into four quadrants, the negative space typically occupied by pews or other seating. Churches are further partitioned at the beginning of services by what is called surveying, which is a sanctification ritual that involves pouring water and other sacred substances at the four perimeter corners of the church in a sequence that crisscrosses the center area so as to trace the shape of an X, the Roman numeral for 10, there representing the biblical 10 commandments along the floor. The superimposition of these two crosses has been interpreted to mean, in the words of Bishop Andre, who I quoted earlier, quote, Christ's fulfillment of the law and his sacrifice and the idea that we are under his grace. The two crosses converge at the symbolic center of the church, where the four nations of the spiritual world meet. The point is conceptualized as, quote, Jerusalem, the heart of the Christian cosmos, and crossroads of the spiritual Baptist universe. The auspicious junction, indicated in nearly all Baptist churches by a specially marked area or center post, is associated with Jesus Christ and likened to Jacob's ladder, a mystical conduit joining the earth to the heavens. As a nexus between carnal and spiritual worlds, the center area functions as a channel for conveying spirit to the congregation and connecting the faithful to mystical forces unseen. Intimating its folk origins in ancient Christianity, the center pole, if present, is said to represent the timber of Lebanon, the material purportedly used to construct Solomon's temple in biblical times. Whether the site of this symbolic center of the church, and by metonym, the very faith itself, is a pole or an axis mundi, a cosmic pillar reaching from the floor, earth, to the ceiling, heaven, or if it's just a specially marked area designated by some other ornamental structure, depends on the church. There are nearly as many variants of pedestals, columns, decorative basins, and other objects used to mark the sacred center as there are spiritual Baptist churches. No two are exactly alike. In any case, the sanctified location may be adorned with a full complement of liturgical implements available to congregants, including, especially, multicolored flags representing different spiritual entities and nations, also various vessels containing water, leaves, and flowers, as well as the ever-present lota, taria, and calabash, along with candles, bells, conch shells, cords, and the like. Many, if not all of these items are associated with one or another spiritual school or nation, signifying Africa, India, China, or Assyria. Assembled at the center, this collage of diverse symbols, a spatial juxtaposition of the varied multicultural elements of the faith, represents a microcosm of the eclectic cosmopolitan spiritual universe. Along with the altar and the four corners, the center area is the most sacred and ritually important location of the church. It's considered a church's spiritual foundation and is used to chart its proper dimensions. Some leaders of the church claim that when a person receives a church, that is, when they receive the guidance and commission from the Holy Spirit to raise a temple or place of worship, they receive a center pole or other object with it. Whatever marks the symbolic center, it tends to be an unmistakable focal point of services. Upon entering the church, Baptists genuflect first at the center pole, where Jesus is said to dwell and where the power of the Holy Spirit is always present. Formal prayers are offered there, dancing and manifestations of spirit can take place around it, and such rites as the dedication of infants and the directing of baptismal candidates also occurs there. Churchgoers insist that the center pole is not itself an object of prayer or adoration, but rather an index of Christ's law and a critical dissension point of the Holy Spirit. It's a point of contact with the spiritual world, explains a veteran Baptist teacher from Port of Spain. Quote, in our faith, we do not venerate the pole, but the pole has a spiritual meaning and focus, of course. If done correctly, veneration can happen there. because the energy of the church is always centered at the center pole. So it's like if it were a magnet pulling everything to the center, end quote. The teacher's reference to the center pole's attractive magnetism is not incidental. The pull of the center area draws worshipers to it and focuses their collective attention on calling down the Holy Spirit. Devotion proceeds in a clockwise direction around the center pole as participants encircle the consecrated site in dance and exaltation. The directional arrows in the cosmogram I showed earlier denote the general flow of activity around the center area. Circumambulation of the center, or going around the pole in the vernacular, is commonly done during worship services. Baptists interpret this practice as symbolic of the Israelites encircling and throwing down the perimeter walls of Jericho, as described in the book of Joshua. In addition to bringing together a community of worshipers and a plethora of ritual objects, the center area signifies the convergence of all four spiritual schools or nations. The magnetism of the center is in this way not just centripetal, it's also unifying because it represents the consolidation of the diverse spiritual universe, the four separate ideas of godliness, together as one under the auspices of Jesus Christ, the center of the faith personified. Metaphorically speaking, then, it's here where diverse ethno-national modalities of spirit become incorporated functions of a unified Christian complex, located in Jerusalem and administered under Jesus Christ's supreme authority. I'm going to go through about 10 pictures, just really quickly, to give you an idea of some of the variation of the center areas and center features. There's the two photos, a different thing, ways in which you would see center poles represented. The first picture is a image taken from the entrance of the church, looking through the center pole to the altar. The other picture is a picture from the side door, looking through to the next side door. The entrance is on your right, and the altar would be on your left. Again, this is a picture of the center pole from the side door, the altar on the left. The entrance would be on your right of this photo. And I just wanted to give you some sense of, these are, the first few images are images of center poles when present. They're not always poles, they're also center features. I'll get to a couple photos of that as well. You might have noticed some ship's wheels attached to some of these. I'll explain that in a little bit as well. Here's an example. The picture is taken from the entrance, looking at the altar through the center area. This church does not have a pole. Side doors are to the left and right of the photo. Similarly, this is a picture of a center feature from the altar looking at the entrance of the church. And you can see the side doors on left and right. It's a picture from the side. There's a lot of different examples. Like I said, no church is exactly the same, and how they, what actually marks the center area. Of course, the center area is significant in all the churches, and the implements are more or less the same. Here you have sort of like a rock pedestal. This center feature is of a drum. Here you have a picture on the right here is where the entrance is. This is a brass center feature. Allusions to the center pole's magnetism, indeed its gravitational qualities and the circle of activities that converge around it, invoke images of spiral galaxies and the celestial origins of our visible universe. For the faithful, the spiral is symbolic of evolution and spiritual development, though has other occult and esoteric significance depending on who you talk to. Atop a mirrored pedestal, installed at the center of Mount Bethel Crystal Cathedral, located in St. Madeleine, in Trinidad, visitors will encounter a crystalline spiral statuette, the spiral of the universe, placed alongside a miniature ocean liner. Its prominent position at the center of the church affirms the symbolic significance of the spiral and its mystical import to the faithful. The church is in many ways, or many respects, then, an imago mundi, a physical representation of the spiritual universe, and the center pole, its axis mundi, the cosmic pillar around which it turns, a divine spindle gathering together diverse threads of the faith. This fairly straightforward conceptualization lends itself to further levels of abstraction, since the center area is not necessarily or even usually located at the actual center of the church. Most churches, as mentioned, are rectangular in shape and partitioned by aisles indicating a cross, the intersection of which denotes the symbolic or spiritual rather than actual physical center of the church. Incredibly, some Baptists instruct that if possible, the center post should be installed according to a geometric formula based on the golden ratio. Following this prescription, the church should approximate what in geometry is called a golden rectangle, where the center pole marks the point from which the golden spiral, the spiral of the universe, emanates. Although it's rare to find a church that approaches this ideal, it's nonetheless a compelling proposition for any Baptist to make, especially given the fact that such claims imply a creolized spatial logic to spiritual Baptist churches that extends well beyond conventional Christian symbology and multinational imagery to include distinctly esoteric concepts, occult knowledge, and extra-religious ciphers that are not always apparent to observers or neophytes. Spiritual Baptist theories of ritual space are routinely read in ways that reinforce the plural eclectic imaginary on which the cosmology depends. Some Baptists, for example, point to the similarities obtaining between the structural layout of the church and the tree of life in Jewish mysticism, observing that the nodes and pathways of the Sephirot map closely onto the sacred four corners, altar, center area, entrance, and side doors of the church. That's what that is. Kind of see, it's a little image. Additional interpretations propose that an analogous correlation also obtains between sacred areas of the church and the focal points of the chakra system, as seen in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Other believers have located the origins and significance of the center pole in Africa, and still others point to a link between the processions around the center pole and Muslim circumambulation of the Kaaba in Mecca. Spiritually comprehensive, yet subordinate to Christian authority, the physical arrangement of the church in Imago Mundi reinforces the terms of the spiritual Baptist cosmology and underscores important theological stipulations that believers hold fast. The cosmogram I've figured here is revelatory of the symbolic ways in which spiritual Baptists make Christian sense of their diverse spiritual universe. Through the language of space, Baptists regularly assert the preeminence of biblical authority by foregrounding the literal and figurative centrality of Christian symbolism. Even as it accommodates eclectic signs and symbols from across the religious spectrum, the spatial grammar of Baptist cosmology is to a great extent determined by Christian signs and precepts in accordance with Baptist biblical exegesis. Whatever one's pathway in the spirit, be it represented by the African, Indian, Chinese, or Assyrian corners of the church, representing the four corners of the earth, all roads in the end lead to the same destination, to Jerusalem, and the quote, wisdom, knowledge, and understanding it affords the faithful along their spiritual journey. Helping to visualize the relationship between spiritual and carnal worlds, a manual used in ordination classes goes a step further to explain the arcane symbolism behind the church's layout in terms of the seal of Melchizedek. Ministers in the diocese that I work closest with are initiated into what is said to be the order of Melchizedek, and are taught that early church floor formation was based on an 8-pointed star, the seal of Melchizedek, which is formed by two overlapping or interlaced squares. When superimposed on the floor of a spiritual Baptist church, each point of the star indicates a ritually significant area of the church, the entrance, the altar, side doors, and the four corners, thus marking the same 8 auspicious points indicated by overlapping crosses that I mentioned earlier, the cross and the X. In biblical numerology, which is sometimes cited by the Baptists that I work with, the number 8 is associated with Jesus Christ and his resurrection on the, quote, 8th day, and it's therefore an important number representative of baptism and rebirth. Here's just an image of an octagon marking the center area. The seal itself is a cosmogram, a geometric representation of spiritual and physical worlds rendered on a two-dimensional plane. One square is said to represent the physical carnal world, while the other represents the spiritual unseen or immaterial world. The fact that both squares are interwoven with one another, according to believers, signifies the interaffective relations between them. Indeed, the overlapping of squares in the seal is a purposeful metaphor for capturing the way in which the spiritual world is thought to be co-present with the earthly material world. That is, quote, one on top of the other, as stated by Apostle Michael and quoted at the beginning of my talk. Furthermore, it's taught that the two planes rotate in concert on a central axis, the center pole of the church, evoking the idea of continuity and signifying, quote, eternity, renewal, and unity between realms. The analogy helps to explain the relationship between discrete but interrelated material and immaterial worlds. At the same time, it encapsulates a phenomenology of spirit manifestation and metaphysical travel where ecstatic worshipers are simultaneously here on earth and not here in the spiritual realm. Spiritual Baptist cosmology, therefore, is not just based on a sacred geography. It entails a sacred geometry, the properties and relations of shapes, points, lines, and their dimensions, including squares, rectangles, circles, spirals, and more, along with their movement in time and space. Graphic geometric elaborations like the seal of Melchizedek dovetail in accordance with Baptist numerology, helping to summarize complex cosmological and theological concepts, making them simpler for churchgoers to understand and easier in turn to influence through ritual action. For spiritual Baptists, spirit has form, function, and identity, made even more authoritative by impressive confirmatory rites and compelling ecstatic practices. It might even be possible to describe spiritual Baptists as metaphysical positivists, because for believers, the spiritual and non-material world is as real as the earthly phenomenal one and can be verified empirically in much the same way. Conventional everyday rituals corroborate for churchgoers the ordinary reality of the spiritual realm around them and the putative efficacy of their theological claims about it by facilitating the experience and direct observation of supernatural phenomena. Embodied spectacles like speaking in tongues or catching power and astral travel are routine manifestations of spirit that take center stage during Baptist rites and services and aid in substantiating the incontrovertible authority of the spiritual dimension on the everyday lives of believers. The Baptist emphasis on spirit takes many forms, from a capacious notion of spirituality and consciousness of otherworldly matters to a robust belief in transcendent sacred powers, including anthropomorphic entities and their capacity to influence human affairs. This comprehensive, highly creolized notion of spirit is not limited to the signs and wonders associated with the early Christian church, nor is it restricted to familiar mainstream concepts of the Holy Spirit. Instead, Baptist epistemologies of spirit, embellished by a cosmopolitan spiritual substrate, encompass a host of enchanted objects, personages, landscapes, and substances that make up the spiritual world and help define its ethno-national features and geographic boundaries. Spiritual Africa, India, China, and Assyria are not only distinct locations in the spiritual realm, but in the Baptist lexicon, they're also schools where the converted are spiritually educated during the morning ritual, or the morning ceremony. All baptized church members are at one time or another encouraged to participate in the formal rite of what they call mourning, a higher consciousness-seeking ritual involving an extended period of prayer, fasting, seclusion, and deprivation. While on the mourning ground, and this is an image, it may be too dark to see, but they're in this kind of room, this is the mourning ground. While on the mourning ground, which is in an isolated room near or attached to the church, mourners, who are also called pilgrim travelers, through the cultivation of trance-like states, traverse the spiritual realm, where they explore foreign landscapes and converse with gods, saints, and other beings, who convey important messages and give them advice. Later, these spiritual expeditions are mapped by the tracking of pointers. Usually, these are mothers or leaders of the church who are responsible for guiding pilgrims during the ritual. And they record these experiences in summary reports that are given by the mourners when they return from the spiritual lands. By, quote, giving their tracks, that is, by giving an account of their spiritual journeys, pilgrims effectively serve as amateur cosmographers, cataloging the details of their experiences traveling the spiritual lands and revealing with each subsequent visit more of the mysteries that lie beyond the veil. Pilgrims, as a result of these auspicious journeys, receive their work or commission from the Holy Spirit to labor in the vineyard as mothers, as nurses, as warriors, as teachers, as captains, seers, pointers, provers. It goes on and on and on. There's many different titles that they assume. And they gain insight into their spiritual purpose or path, which is also understood as their true nature or identity in the spirit, a spiritual disposition that's assigned an ethnic quality such as African, Indian, Chinese, or Syrian, according to the spiritual school where the mourner was educated. Which of the 4 spiritual schools a Baptist is revealed to be in has to do with the realm or manifestation of spiritual consciousness that they can access, the guardian angels they walk with, and the elements and powers they work with to heal, to prophecy, to point, to preach. A person who has been identified with the Indian school tends to enter trance-like states or Holy Spirit possession in, quote, the Indian way, which might involve mimicking Hindi while speaking in tongues, donning ceremonial garments such as saris or kurtas, or performing mudras and other related ritual movements during ecstatic worship. It follows that Trinbagonians of African descent, who constitute the vast majority of spiritual Baptist membership, might be considered Black or Afro-Trinidadian carnally, but viewed as Chinese or Indian spiritually. Moreover, a modeling of the earthly and spiritual worlds is established through ritual items and symbols, dance, as well as ecstatic practice. This form of mapping is observable in the cosmological layout of the churches, as well as in the performative rituals carried out by the faithful, that through their enactment bring the spiritual world into being. This idea is underlined by the assertion that when one is in trance, or what's called dancing in the spirit, one's earthly bodily movements mirror what is said to be happening in the spiritual realm. Each nation, for example, is represented by a different dance style. Dancing in the spirit occasions a range of manifestations that are not necessarily or even usually distinguishable as certain powers or anthropomorphic entities, as seen, for example, in Orisha manifestations or in Trinidadian Kabbalah. More commonly, entranced dancers reflect the spiritual location, Africa, India, China, Assyria, of the spirit through their movements, often manifesting behaviors associated with the spiritual environment in which churchgoers find themselves immersed in ecstatic worship. Apostle Michael describes it thusly, quote, when someone gets into what they call get into the spirit, it means she starts to interact in the spiritual realm. So she's here, yes, she's here, but her mind, her spirit soul is already tapping into the unseen realm. So she's moving here, and what's happening is that her body is giving off the symptom of what's going on there in the spiritual realm. So for instance, we might be in a cold room here on earth, and she might be by a fireside there in the spiritual realm, but her body here will be sweating. That's because of where she's located at spiritually. Your own spirit soul has a direct manifestation in your body, end quote. In a way that's akin to astral projection. The physical body is theorized here as separate from the spirit body or soul, which has the ability to travel great distances and to interact in the non-physical realm. Although travels to the spiritual realm are sometimes described as visions, when they take place on the morning ground or during worship services, they're understood not as dreams or visions per se, but as out-of-body experiences, as astral travel, during which one's spiritual consciousness or spirit body actually visits real places. It makes good sense then that the mourners would be called pilgrims, and their spiritual travels likened to, quote, being on the road. It is commonplace, in fact, to hear Baptists discuss going to mourn in order to, quote, walk through India, or to walk the depths and breadth of Assyria as a function of their spiritual education. The spiritual world is acknowledged, brought into being, and continually remade through performative rituals and travelers' accounts that testify not only to the existence of the spiritual realm, but also to its ethno-national dimensions, its geographic features, and to the parallel reality it is thought to portray. Through these different forms of empirical evidence, the diverse cosmopolitan spiritual world is constituted in symbiotic and mirrored relation to the earthly world, and explored to uncover the mysteries of the spirit. Baptist cosmology is not conceived in two horizontal dimensions alone. It's also rendered vertically. Significantly, the earthly world is visualized as situated above or on top of the spiritual world. Not at all in hierarchical terms of greater or lesser, but in spatial terms, in terms of depth and distance. These are relative positions, of course, conceptualized in terms of above and below, up and down. It is believed that the spiritual world lies somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, of the sea, of consciousness, of visual perception. To access the spiritual realm, then, in order to, quote, seek the spirit, the Baptist faithful must, quote, go down, as they say. One of the more common euphemisms, in fact, to going to mourn, for example, include, quote, going down, going underground, being, quote, put down, as in, I'm going down next week, or I'm being put down next month. That means that you're going to mourn next week, or you're going to mourn next month. This high-low, up-down relationship may map well onto mainstream Christian concepts of heaven and hell, but neither are discussed much in Baptist circles. Good and evil are rarely figured in here, anyway, in Manichaean terms, while heaven and hell as concepts are largely left unelaborated by church leaders. Rather, vertical cosmological orientations are elaborated in the conflation of spiritual and afterworlds, and in particular, conventional associations linking the mourning ritual with death and rebirth. This is another image from a mourning room. A popular dysphomism of going to mourn is, quote, being put in the grave, since the mourning room is sometimes referred to as the tomb, and the ritual itself is designed to model Christ's entombment and resurrection. The often cited axiom, as above, so below, which is a popular saying in New Age circles but has its roots in modern occultism, is invoked from time to time by Baptists in ways that reinforce both the verticality of their cosmology and the mirrored relationship that obtains between the two worlds. In Trinidadian Kabbalah, which draws heavily from esoteric and occult literatures and has a strong influence on spiritual Baptist religion, cosmological verticality is elaborated in a language of floors. When a Kabbalistic entity manifests at a seance, they announce their name, their number, their flight, and the floor from where they came. The floor identifies what level or plane of existence the entity is visiting from. The floors are numbered and go down depending on whether the forces or energies manifesting are considered celestial or infernal. The idea of a complementary universe defined in terms of above and below is reinforced by the symbolism of the calabash, which Baptists associate with Africa and traditional African spiritual concepts. Echoing a traditional Yoruba conceptualization of the cosmos as, quote, a big gourd with two halves, The two halves of the calabash represent binary aspects of the visible and invisible universe. The top half, or container's lid, signifies the visible human earthly world, while the bottom half, or base of the calabash, is said to represent the invisible spiritual world below. Are you getting a lot of feedback, or is it just me? You can hear me clearly? Okay, good. Travel is a central concept in the spiritual Baptist faith. Journeys, voyages, serve as popular metaphors for spiritual growth and rites of passage, as well as everyday rituals. Hymns and sermons often contain travel imagery, and symbols of navigation are abundant and regularly feature nautical themes. The church itself is sometimes allegorized as a ship, and the spiritual world compared with the ocean's watery depths. Most churches have a designated captain, who they call the captain. It's a member of the church who's responsible for ensuring that the ship, or the church, while service is in progress, sails smoothly. Anthropologist Marit Ford explains that the captain's duties include steering the boat out of the harbor at the beginning of services, meaning that he, quote, helps to start the service in such a way that the congregation becomes detached from their carnal preoccupations and spiritual connections become possible. It is the responsibility of the ship's passengers, that's the congregation, to ensure that the vessel remains afloat by calling the Holy Spirit to take charge of the proceedings. The ship's destination becomes apparent when participants begin to, quote, get in the spirit and reveal through representative dance styles and ecstatic worship, and also through songs, their relative locations in either Africa, India, China, or Assyria. Besides the obvious associations with baptism and water, spiritual Baptists invest water and water imagery with considerable meaning and importance. The open sea symbolizes the spiritual world. Its navigation and mastery are considered emblematic of wisdom and devotion, and its depths recall the outer reaches of esoteric spiritual knowledge pursued by the faithful. When discussing matters of spirit, the mysteries of the spiritual realm are likened to the depths of the sea and measured in fathoms and leagues. If a pilgrim gets lost in the spirit, which is a particular threat to neophytes on the mourning ground who are traveling to the spiritual lands for the first time, they will call for a Baptist specialist known as a diver to help find and, quote, bring them back up. When nautical metaphors are present, the center pole is sometimes considered the, quote, control of the church, in which case a ship's wheel might be installed. I think I have one, yeah. Either vertically or horizontally, and it's used to steer the church ship on its course through the spiritual lands. The ship's wheel and other navigation symbols, such as the chart and compass, extend the nautical metaphors used to communicate concepts of travel and distance that correspond with Baptist notions of spiritual growth and expanding spiritual consciousness. Reinforced by symbols like the anchor and trident, nautical themes reinforce a close association between water and spiritual enlightenment. There's actually a whole symbology associated with wheels that I'm not really going to get into, but I just wanted to flash a picture because the ship's wheel is often, it isn't exclusively, but often it has 8 spokes. The 8 spokes have its own kind of significance to Baptist numerology. But so if you have more questions about that, maybe later we'll get into it with more questions. But for now, I'll just point it out. Metaphors, anyway, for traveling in the spirit, much like the symbols for figuring the universe as overlapping material and spiritual worlds, help to explain the simultaneous here in the church and there in the spiritual realm aspects of the spiritual Baptist cosmology. The church, a material structure anchored in the physical world, is at once a vessel and a proxy for realizing the parallel realm of spirit. A space of absolute possibility where converts go to make sense of their lives and pursue a version of the good life by attaining a greater knowledge of God and self through spiritual upliftment. Communion with spirit is fostered through the embodied practices of churchgoers in their overseas voyages to the spiritual realm. Ethnic signifiers give the entities and locations they visit an identity and sense of place, nurturing connections with the spiritual realm through spatial and temporal registers that collapse the boundary between here and there, between then and now, diminishing the distance between human and spirit to make communication between them possible. The religious cultures of the Afro-Caribbean world are more alike than different, forged, as it were, in the same fires of conquest, colonialism, slavery, and peonage that created the multiracial, multicultural societies where these traditions flourish. The spiritual Baptist universe, though novel in several respects, shares considerable overlap with other Black Atlantic cosmologies, many of which reflect the complex historical syntheses of classical and contemporary African and African-derived religions with various Christianities and other religious repertoires. New World Afro-diasporic cultural dynamics, characterized by processes of appropriation, revision, reinterpretation, ensure that over time the creolized religious forms that have developed and continue to develop throughout the region share at least some affinities with one another, while also recalling antecedent or cognate formations in Africa, Asia, Europe, and other parts of the Americas. Ritual and aesthetic continuities across the Black Atlantic world are legion and have drawn the attention of scholars for many years. From similar patterns of ecstatic worship to homologous modes of ceremonial spirituality, Afro-Caribbean religions are remarkably consonant both in how believers define the sacred universe and in how they interact with it. One of the more intriguing parallels is the widespread significance assigned to the crossroads, a popular Afro-diasporic religious symbol born in Central Africa that signifies the intersection between physical and spiritual worlds. And unfortunately, the image doesn't come out. There should be basically an X and Y axis with a circle in the center. So just imagine the X and Y axis, and at the ends of each X and Y axis are little circles that designate the sun. Consider, for instance, the equivalences between the diagram of the spiritual Baptist universe that I've detailed here and the Congo sign of the cosmos described by Kim Wadene, Fukiao, and later Robert Ferris Thompson, Wyatt McAfee, and some other anthropologists. According to classical Ba-Congo philosophy, the universe is composed of two mirrored worlds, that of the living and that of the dead, separated by a vast body of water. Life is envisioned as a cyclical progression between them, resembling the path of the sun, such that daytime is analogous to one's physical life on earth, and nighttime is equal to one's otherworldly or spiritual life among the ancestors. Summarizing this idea is the Yawa cross, and this should be an image of the Yawa cross. It's a Congo cosmographic symbol that depicts what they say is the 4 moments of the sun, with intersecting horizontal and vertical axes set within an ellipse representing the transition between worlds and the repetitive cycle of death and rebirth, moving between the earthly and the spiritual world. Each moment of the sun is identified with a cardinal direction, okay? So that, according to Thompson, quote, the summit of the pattern symbolizes not only noon, but also maleness north and the peak of one's physical strength on earth. Correspondingly, the bottom equals midnight femaleness south and the highest point of a person's otherworldly strength. The cosmogram's horizontal axis and you basically just imagine a X and Y axis sort of on the center there. The cosmogram's horizontal axis is a threshold called the Kalunga line. It denotes the watery boundary separating the two worlds and gives way to a series of other binary oppositions like above and below, night and day, living dead, man-God, and define the vertical relations between them. An abbreviated version of the Congo cosmogram is a simple Greek cross that's marked on the ground for the purposes of oath-taking, the center or intersection of which indicates, according to Thompson, a, quote, point of contact between worlds. However similar it is to the Christian cross, the original Congo cruciform has nothing to do with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and developed quite independently from Christian civilization. Before the arrival of Europeans, it represented for the Ba-Congo an encapsulation of their ideas about the world and their place within it. In the Americas, where it was likely introduced by enslaved Africans via the transatlantic slave trade, its significance has been augmented by Christian signs and concepts. Its ritual import only made stronger through amalgamation and reinterpretation. The legacy of the Congo cross is visible today in symbols used by African-inspired ritual specialists from Cuba to Brazil, who acknowledge the crossroads as a powerful medium for eliciting spiritual contact. The spiritual Baptist and Congo cosmograms summarize a remarkable array of shared philosophical and religious principles underlying their respective worldviews. Both articulate in symbolic form a parallel or mirrored relationship between separate but interrelated physical and metaphysical domains. By projecting the universe onto a two-dimensional plane oriented around intersecting lines relative to the four cardinal directions, both conceptual schemes invest the crossroads with sacred significance and acknowledge, ritually and diagrammatically, an auspicious point of contact between the material and the non-material world. For spiritual Baptists, that connection point is established at the junction of the cross, at the center area of the church, marked by the center pole, and ritually enacted or traced through the surveying rites that open services and prepare the church for the arrival of the Holy Spirit. The circle of worship around the center evokes the cycle of the sun and the continuity of life conveyed in the Yahweh cross. The Baptist faithful travel back and forth to the spiritual realm as they ritually move through all four corners of the earth, transcending the limits of the physical world to commune together in spirit. The pouring of water during rituals, no less than the numerous metaphors equating the spiritual realm with the open sea, harken back to the watery boundary dividing two worlds in Congo cosmology. Tellingly, congregations travel by seafaring church ships on their way to visit the spiritual lands, a world that lies across the ocean just beyond the horizon. The transcendent significance of the crossroads is a striking feature of spiritual Baptist cosmology. At one with the Christian cross, it constitutes a powerful symbol that both represents and facilitates a spiritual connection. Ford observes that its ritual significance to Baptists is plain to see in the fact that all roadside preaching and missions are arranged at the, quote, meeting of four roads, an auspicious junction that regularly invites spiritual connections. The crossroads are equally significant in the greater Congo Atlantic, for whom the turn in the path, according to Thompson, remains an indelible concept as the point of intersection between the living and the dead. Indeed, between the earthly and the spiritual for successive generations of African descendants and their religious cultures in the New World. Just to conclude, I've considered here several layers of spiritual Baptist cosmology in order to lay bare the creolized architecture of the faith and to demonstrate some of the unique ways in which believers derive meaningful coherence out of their eclectic, Christian-centered universe. Travel metaphors, fundamental to the spatial grammar of spiritual Baptist rites, work in tandem with a conceptual framework that defines spirit in terms of a sacred cosmopolitan geography. Diverse modalities of spirit come alive in the embodied practices of churchgoers, who through ecstatic worship and regular visits to the spiritual realm bring to life an enchanted world of people and places endowed with mystical power. The church, a model of the spiritual world, its center and axis mundi, is organized around the cross, the authoritative symbol of the Christian universe, but no less so a diffuse Black Atlantic symbol of the crossroads, signifying and making possible contact with the spiritual realm. By exploring the spatial dynamics underlying spiritual Baptist epistemologies, I hope to have illustrated the novel representational practices central to meaning-making in the church, while shedding light on the dimensions of space that inform Baptist and other Afro-Creole ritual logics. Thank you. And I invite your questions, comments, and thoughts, and whatever responses.
Should we move over to this way?
Sure, yeah, whatever's easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this clicker just in case I have to reference it.
our, we'll take questions from the, get into it, yeah, from the Slido. We have questions from the audience, and Carolina will carry the microphone around, and then questions from the Slido website as well. So we'll start with audience questions, I think.
Yeah, if I don't look you in the eyes, it's because I'm being blind.
Okay.
I've been looking in your direction.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brendan. That was really much more informative than lunch. So thank you. My questions are numerous. First of all, I saw flags. What are these flags? Second of all, I saw a lot of women. Didn't see much men. Third of all, there seemed to be some kind of uniforms. And fourth, does music play a role?
All right, I will tackle these in the order that you mentioned them. The flags themselves are usually significant. Okay. Hello, hello? Okay. Ah, look at that. Magical. This question is about flags, firstly. The flags have different significance, but the color tends to be associated with different either spiritual nations or spiritual entities. And so red, for example, is associated with St. Michael. Sometimes they're national flags, but they wouldn't necessarily, they're up there for the color, it's not necessarily for the nation itself. So if you saw the Dutch flag, for example, it would be there for the colors, it wouldn't be there for signifying the Dutch nation or Holland or something like that. So sometimes you see national flags, literal national flags, but they're up there for the color typically. But that can vary too. There's some amount of individual variety. The clothes themselves, or what was the second one? Clothes was the third. More women than men. Yeah, I mean, I would say membership is predominantly dominated by women and older women, for sure. There's a lot to say about that, but the easy dismissive way of answering that is most organized religions are dominated by women. But in this case, it skews number-wise highly toward women, older women especially. The clothes themselves, there was a question about that. The clothes themselves are amazing, and again, in relation to the flags, the colors are meaningful for the spiritual clothes. Every Sunday, when you go out in Trinidad, you'll see folks, waiting on the bus or, going to church. They stand out because of these really fantastic outfits. The clothes themselves are spiritual clothes, and they're worn for spiritual work. They have protective aspects to them. They have they say that they receive these clothes from the spirit. So when they visit the spiritual realm on the morning ground, they're given an outfit, the color, the way that it's supposed to be worn, the headdress, cords that they might wear on it. All of those are given to them by the spirit from mourning. You're not really allowed to wear whatever you want to wear. You wear what's given to you in terms of spiritual clothes. And so if there's spiritual work that's scheduled in the church, if there's a baptism or there's a pointing or a healing or something, you're usually instructed to wear your spiritual clothes for that purpose. And again, the colors are associated with different, St. Anne or St. Michael, or they can also have reference to the spiritual nation, right? So the colors that I showed on the cosmogram that I showed at the beginning, I included the colors that are associated with spiritual India. The colors are typically yellow and brown. Spiritual Africa is associated with pink and blue, and so if your spiritual identity is associated with those, you're probably gonna your spiritual clothes are probably gonna be blue or pink, depending on, you can have that kind of variation. So the music, unfortunately, we're kind of limited technologically, but typical Baptist services last 4 to 5 hours. I'm not kidding. It's 4 to 5 hours. And it's singing of hymns and particular Baptist songs called Sankeys. And so it kind of rises and falls in the sort of energy level throughout the 4 or 5 hours, but the singing is constant. It's almost nonstop unless someone's preaching or reading from the Bible. The vast majority of the time is spent singing hymns and different joyous songs that are accompanied by drums. And a considerable amount of hand clapping and shouting and foot tapping and the like.
We'll take another, and one more present audience, and then we'll go to an online, but Jifa.
Okay, yeah, I just had a question. In terms of, you showed like when they were like practicing the rituals or traveling to the spiritual world, is it only through worship, like in which aspects of the specific spiritual nation they travel to is manifested, or does it take over like all of their daily activities?
Great question. So typically, I tried to show pictures of, it's a little odd taking pictures of people who are kind of entranced. But there's two or three, as my understanding is that there's about 2 or 3 different ways in which folks can be said to be in the spiritual realm or visiting the spiritual realm. The first and primary one is through that morning ceremony where it's cultivated. They pray and they fast for several weeks before going to the morning ground, laying down on the ground. They get their heads, their eyes and face, they put bands on them so they can't see. They sleep on the ground. And that deprivation inclines them to, be able to visit the spiritual realm. And they're visiting places like, typically what people describe are locations like temples, but they usually, their company, I visited this temple, I was in India, or maybe they don't know where they are, but someone else in the church will help them figure out where it is, but it's usually India or China or Africa or Syria. During worship services, there's a lot, if the energy is really high and the Holy Spirit is said to be there and engaging with the congregation, they will speak in tongues and do different things that indicate what spiritual realm the congregation is in. But the individuals who are speaking tongues are the ones who are said to be in those places. So, and you'll see sometimes multiple people will be speaking in tongues and will be having a conversation between one another, and what they'll say is that they're having a conversation in the spiritual world. We can't understand them because we're here on earth, but they're having a dialogue in the spiritual realm. The other is people visit the spiritual realm during sleep, but that one's a little bit harder. They don't tend to authenticate those because you could just be dreaming. And I didn't get a chance to say, like, a lot of the authenticity of these visits is tested by church members. You can't just say you were there. You had to prove that you were there and prove that these spirit entities talked to you in this way and prove that those individuals gave you these things that you say they gave you. Because again, when they make these trips on the morning ground to the spiritual realm, it's about receiving their titles and their jobs and the gifts from the Holy Spirit that will allow them to take up positions in the church as leaders or as mothers, as nurses or what have you. Does that answer your?
Yes, and is there like a specific nation? Does one have superiority over the other in terms of like spiritual enlightenment? Or?
Yeah, not at all, but there are associations with, people tend to associate some nations with different capacities, and so I've heard some people say that spiritual India, if you were educated in spiritual India, that's a more of a learning and a teaching nation, and so teachers often are the ones that come out of that nation, for example. Warriors come out of the African nation. I've heard people say that, but I've also heard other Baptists sort of say, well, you can get those roles in the church from any of the nations, but they don't see them as hierarchical in any way. That being said, most people that I've met were either educated in the Indian school or the African school. It's very rare to find folks that were, educated in the Chinese school or have this sort of spiritual identity associated with Assyria. But they say that there are, and
Thank you.
There's a related question online about, does each congregation need to have members from all four spiritual groups?
Not as I understand it, but congregations will tend to have, in my experience and what I've seen, tend to have more folks in one school than another. So some churches tend to be more oriented toward the Indian school, and that's probably because the leader of that church or the mother of that church has already established that connection to the spiritual realm, and it's stronger. And if she's the one that's bringing people to mourn and pointing them, which is just directing them on the spiritual realm, those are the areas that she's most familiar with. So it's likely that those individuals will come out of that, those areas. So as far as I understand, you don't need that kind of coverage just to have a church, but you may find that some churches tend to skew more one way or another. That's been my experience.
Catherine.
Hi, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. I have two questions. One of them is, I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about how you got into this research, sort of the development of relationships and sort of that aspect of the ethnographic work. And then second, this is such an incredible sort of depiction of sort of the spatial metaphors, ways of thinking. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how temporal realities, like, narrating the past, connections between past and present, either sort of in terms of ancestors or in terms of how they're, narrating the own history of their church, how that intersects with these sort of spatial metaphors.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Maybe I'll do it backward, yeah? So this is not a place where you would find a lot of ancestor references or ancestor worship. And in fact, the conversations that I've had with folks regarding ancestor worship is that it's off limits for them. There's some injunction that they found in the Bible against it, and so I've heard them say that that's not okay. That being said, I've never met a spiritual Baptist that wasn't open to pretty much anything. So it's not like they don't recognize that ancestor worship is a thing or that the ancestors matter in particular ways. It's not a major part of their ritual life. So in terms of that kind of temporal thing, I haven't seen much of it. It doesn't mean it's not there, but certainly not in my experience. Often, I'd have to think about it, but I think the immediate things that come to mind are, people will make references to the history of the faith to the degree that they understand it, which is composed in primarily two or three important moments. One is that they connect it to the birth of Christianity and that the origins of this faith are in ancient Christianity. The second is that there were, between 1917 and 1951, there was a shouter prohibition ordinance which prohibited their religious practices. Spiritual Baptists are also known as shouter Baptists. That is a sort of moment that is a sort of anchor for meaningful construction of their own sort of religious identity, but also some of the rituals we talked about, sort of the idea of a square and being able to mark out ritual space even when you don't have a church was kind of important, or it gets picked up in sort of their discourse about where the faith is, what the faith is about. But not a whole lot. That kind of temporal thing isn't as primary. It just comes to my immediate mind that maybe it could be. I'm sure there's some good reason for that, and maybe the fact that there isn't is something I should think more about. So thank you for that question. How I got into this, I'm going to give you the really, really short. This is a great question, of course. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I worked in the Dominican Republic for many years, and I worked with Pentecostal Christians. I got very interested in Christianity, but the anthropology of Christianity, really thinking about what Christians are doing outside of the book or the church. And if you know anything about Pentecostal Christians, is they don't like anything that's not Pentecostal Christianity. So anything is like demonic. These Christians I knew a little bit about, and I knew that that was not the case for them. They're more like, hey, nothing's demonic and anything could be interesting. You know, then they're really open to a lot of different ideas, and I think I was drawn to it that way. I had an advisor in graduate school who'd worked in Trinidad for 15, 20 years. I said, hey, I'm going to come down there. He's like, that's great. I'll give you a tour of the island. I went down there in January 2017. He drove me around the island for 3 or 4 days. I had kind of reached out to a couple folks at the university there that I met with, and I had met someone previous, maybe a year before, who said I could invited me to her church there. So that's how I started. I lived there for about 5 months. Went to a variety of different churches. I settled on one church community that was really warm and opening to me being there. And after that, I have a job, so I can't just live there for 2 years. So I've been going back and forth. And really, I'm fortunate to have found folks that appreciate my presence there, and I've been lucky enough to kind of meet friends and have them open up that world for me. We can talk more about it later, but it's a good question. It's a long answer to that too.
I guess we have one more question from the audience, and do we have to stop at 5? Is that, because I do have more questions down here.
I can answer questions. I got time. Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Where am I going to go?
All right. So I don't know how to frame this question, but you showed us a lot of symbolism. So when they're kind of doing this, whatever rituals, so they're speaking in their tongues. These are just made up words and sentences. And then that's one question. So in part, I'm interested in words. So like names and words, and are there anything in those words that kind of take us to that place between physical, spiritual world, place names? I'm not sure, just the words. I'm particularly thinking about, are there any ideophones? I'm really fascinated by ideophones, sound, the words that kind of capture sound, movement of things. Are there such things in their cosmology that get to that kind of a place that you're trying to map out?
Yeah, so when Baptists go to the spiritual realm on the morning ground, for example, some of the gifts that they're given or tools that they're given either by the mother of the church or the leader to help them navigate the spiritual realm, they call keys. And the keys are usually either a Bible verse, could be a word. It's often a verse of a song or a hymn. And they're taught to use that to get out of trouble, or they're used to access different things, right? They can also receive those keys on the morning ground from other entities who will give them those things. So words are important, particularly in the ways that they're wielded in more formal, there's a whole esoteric thing with words and a kind of whole theology associated with words that some more kind of a higher level church leaders that are really into. But for the regular laity, it's not really about words, because words can be transformative, and the church leaders are very particular about that. In terms of the speaking in tongues, although it's automatopoeia, the way in which it comes out, I think I said in the talk, if you're associated with spiritual India, it sounds like Hindi. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It can be mimicking some language. There are certain sounds that people make that are recognizably that person is in spiritual Africa. That's what they say, but at the same time, there's all this other information that's telling you what spiritual world they're visiting. The drums are playing particular rhythms that are associated with India or Africa. The singing of a particular song, you wouldn't sing that song if we were visiting spiritual India, for example. We only sing that song when we're in spiritual Africa. So maybe, I've tried to transcribe some of the automatopoeia, but I don't know that that's really, it hasn't gotten me anywhere anyway. That's a great question, thank you. Are there some?
I'll take one from down here, the online. There's sort of a question about positionality, your positionality. What are the ethical considerations, especially for scholars of African descent, in seeking shared practices that were intended to remain secret? One of those main questions that anthropologists, religious studies scholars get all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I showed a couple pictures in the morning ground, the morning room. You're not allowed to take pictures in the morning room. Those pictures are, one of them was published in a book some years ago, and the other one is published online somewhere. So I didn't feel too, I mean, and they aren't a picture, I mean, they're kind of older, they're not of folks that I know. It's something that I do care about and I think about, and I talk to the people that I work with about. I mean, I've always been open, and I think that's, I don't want to divulge something that they don't want me to divulge. And, in my experience, it's been, hey, this is okay to see and talk about, but this isn't. Most people, if it's something like that, the folks that I work with are really happy to share their faith with other people, and they see working with an anthropologist as a way to authorize and validate and legitimate what they're doing. So I do see that as part of my job as well. I'm not out to ask certain questions that would make them look foolish or something like that. It's something that I do think about, and it's something that I think is a constant negotiation with the folks that I work with. But I don't think I'm divulging any secrets necessarily, as far as I know. But I also think that depending on what group you're working with and what they're working with, that can have different, can mean different things. I mean, it really is a good question. Some of the stuff that I do with these folks is private, it's not public, and they've invited me to go to certain functions that are not for the public. I do think I think it's fine to talk about these events, but it's not okay, for example, to record them or photograph them. And so I respect that. It's usually made pretty clear.
We've lost our questions out there.
Well, thank you for the questions. I appreciate the time and people sticking around for it too. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I just want to invite whomever here left. We have a lot of food out here, so I hope you can join us for a few minutes and have some refreshments. So thank you.